Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share some thoughts on Trout Belly Up by Rodrigo Fuentes. This is a collection of short stories, and if you are a fan of the short story tradition that was sort of laid by Chekhov and then extended by writers like Ernest Hemingway and certainly more recently Raymond Carver, this collection is going to be a great fit for your reading taste. The title story in particular, Trout Belly Up, is just fantastic. For the most part, these stories are set in the rural areas of Guatemala, which is where Fuentes is from. Although there's one story that does take place primarily, like exclusively in an urban setting. For the most part, we're out in the countryside. And so we are in a space that feels in between. It feels in between nature and civilization, such that it is with the way humans can treat each other. And it's a space where there's this possibility for life, but also for death. We have characters who feel suddenly more alive being out there in the countryside. Perhaps they're starting up a new business, and so there's this sense of birth and rebirth and new life there. But it's also a space where there is danger. And that those go hand in hand. And Fuentes does a really nice job of allowing those contrasts to shape his stories without, sort of bludgeoning the reader with those images, with those connections. And so he's a strong writer. I would say in particular, the urban story feels very close to what Carver was producing in collections like Cathedral, or what we talk about when we talk about love, that very spare writing about human despair. But I wanted to give a sample of his writing to just give you a sense of what he's doing. That afternoon, Don Henrik talked about his life out east, about the melon plantations he'd set up, about other interesting projects, and my mind had just started to wander when he opened the icebox between his feet and pulled a huge fish out by its tail. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, holding it up. We shifted in our seats, glancing at each other. "It's a trout," said Don Henrik, ignoring someone's raised hand. "A rainbow trout." He turned the creature over, as though wanting the sun to catch all its hidden colors, but in truth, it just looked like any old fish. "This right here is going to bring progress to the mountain," he said, and lifted the trout even higher. That's when I realized Don Henrik was a bit barmy, and I started to warm to him. Don Henrik had traveled all over the world, and in Norway, he told us that afternoon, he'd learned all there was to know about breeding trout. Gesturing toward the top of the mountain in his plot of land, he described where the first cement tanks would go, 3 meters in diameter, 800 trout in each one, and detailed how he'd filter the water, connect pipes up to the spring, feed, and fillet the fish. And so we have this very quick sense of place. We have these characters with immediate characterizations, and then we get a paragraph like this talking about the trout. Trout are delicate creatures and can't handle temperatures over 13 degrees. That's why Don Henrik bought his land right at the top of the mountain, because he wanted ice-cold spring water. But despite being delicate, they're completely savage. They eat meat, even their own. Little cannibals, my Armenia calls them. I remember the first weeks on the trout farm when I'd spend long periods watching them swimming anti-clockwise, all together like a big, happy family. One time a trout began to peel off from the group, rising in tighter circles, until it was flapping about near the surface. Its mouth started to gape and it went belly up, spinning all silvery on its axis. Then something strange happened. Another trout came up to see what was going on, sniffing at its companion. And when from one moment to the next, the whole tank freaked out. The water was churning, looked like it was boiling, and the surface filled with the metallic flashes of a knife fight. A minute later, everything had calmed down. The big family was once again swimming anti-clockwise. There was no sign of the trout that went belly up. And so there we have that contrast, that mention of a knife fight. And on the previous page, the narrator, unnamed, has mentioned that his wife's cousin, Juancho, is up there with them, and that he doesn't really get along with this guy. They're co-workers on this farm, this trout farm Don Henrik has created, but he kind of views Juancho as this almost like older brother to his wife / romantic rival. It's hard to tell. He goes, but the other problem is that he came up here to flee something. There's some danger in his past that at any moment could come back into our present and not just, affect that one character, but affect the whole family. And so that to then go into the trout and how this beautiful description of the trout and what they are and how they move around, and then suddenly the violence that they possess as fish, is this great reminder of what is possible when there's an actual human knife fight occurring. But then he immediately goes from that into, I first met Anneli when we went down to the village shop one day with Jose. Just after I started work on the trout farm, she placed the bag of cement and the wire on the counter, and after handing me my change, smiled at my daughter. "So handsome," she said. "He looks just like his dad." I didn't have the heart to tell her she was a girl, and I know I shouldn't have cared, but I was pleased with the compliment. Later on, he asks her, "Do you have a boyfriend?" Anneli took her time answering. "Not anymore," she said after a while. Lucky me then. She didn't reply, but I sensed that something had changed in the darkness. Aren't I? Lucky? I insisted. Depends, said Annalie, on how you see it. Well, from where I'm standing, I can't see a thing, I told her. They're outside at night in the dark. Me neither, actually, she said. Her voice was different, too. I felt my way over to her, working out where her body was, and so in the dark, we began to kiss. God, she was a good kisser. And so that very just spare, it's not mellifluous language that's with characters spouting off all these words that wouldn't make sense. It's just a wonderful, quick, immediate human connection that forms between characters, or quick, immediate human connections that are rivalries that form between characters across so many of these stories. And so it's an effective set of stories. I think the title story in particular is one I will return to. Others, maybe not quite as much, but it was a good collection overall, and I would be curious to read more from Fuentes. In one other connection I found was that as much as his stories seem to have this realist setting, there is a very thin thread of the picaresque that runs through the stories. And it's not the whimsical picaresque that we sometimes think of with perhaps Cervantes. It's rather that sense of deep ironic humor that can exist within the picaresque, almost a sort of nihilistic picaresque that we find in writers like the Alvaro Mutis in the Mackerel stories, which are absolutely fantastic and can be very, very funny while also absolutely breaking your heart in horrifying stories. Or in Juan Rulfo's his short stories, but also in his great short novel, Pedro, Páramo. And I think that is sort of a direction that Fuentes hints at without necessarily pursuing that direction. He seems much more invested in the tradition of the more realist stories that Hemingway and Carver and Chekhov were creating. But again, I'd be curious to know if anyone has read this work, if anyone has read any of his other works. I believe this is the first that has been translated into English. And he's certainly a story writer that I'll be looking forward to reading more from. So I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.